Hello there, welcome to chapter 7. Now, you might have noticed in the previous chapters that on occasion I might fluff the odd word here or there, and I wanted to ask your patience on that. Because I'm recording these chapters in one continuous take, sometimes if I get to the end of a chapter where I've been recording for about 10 minutes and I fluff a line, I might leave it in there just because it means I don't have to go back and re-record the whole thing again. So I hope that you'll bear with me with that and that it doesn't take you too much out of the story. Chapter 7. Maya and the gnomes trod carefully and quietly through the dark forest, talking only when it was absolutely necessary and scanning the shroud of darkness with their keen eyes. Branches snapped and leaves crunched underfoot, and although they were a woodland folk at heart, the sounds of this forest seemed unfamiliar and strange. The pace was frustratingly slow. The lack of light and the dense undergrowth presented a number of challenges. Low-lying branches lurched out of the blackness, getting caught on items of clothing or scratching exposed skin. Hidden roots caused more than their fair share of tumbles and stifled yelps. For Maya in particular, it was torture on the soles of her feet. The gnomes had kindly wrapped a couple of thick woolen scarves around them like bandages, but this did little to keep out the biting cold or protect her from sharp stones and broken twigs. Their utter lack of orientation was equally frustrating. Without a compass or star in the sky to follow, it was impossible to tell which way they were going, and Maya suppressed a creeping fear that they were just going around and around in circles. One of the gnomes at the back fell over for a third time, and the whole party ground to a halt. "This is impossible," Pete said under his breath. Someone asked if anyone had packed matches. One gnome said they might have, and the idea of a fire was debated, but in the end they all decided a fire might increase the risk of unwanted attention, so they glumly and reluctantly trudged on. After a while, it looked as though they were approaching a small clearing in the woods. To get to it, they had to climb over a number of small boulders clustered around the path. Pete led the way and stepped up onto the first one. As he did, it gave way under his foot. He fell down on top of it, and to his great surprise, the rock began to lash out and shout in a strange language. Suddenly, the cluster of rocks were all moving, and the gnomes found themselves face to face with another group of gnomes, looking equally as terrified and exhausted. "What the blazes?" Pete shouted out. The gnome he'd stepped on pulled a finger to his lips and made a shushing sound. "Terribly sorry," Pete whispered back. "I thought you was a rock." "No, we are gnomes," the fellow whispered back in a jolly accent. "So are we," Pete said with relief, and shook the gnome by the hand and clapped him on the shoulder. "My name is Edmund Longshaps of the Belgica tribes." "Gnomes of the Low Country," Pete said with surprise and delight. "I've heard you lot are a thoroughly decent bunch of folk." "Yes, we try to be," Edmund said with a broad grin. "And you?" "Peter Spriggans of the Sprigganses of Goblin Combe, from the West Country of Old England," Pete said with pride. "I do not know this place," Edmund responded, "but I am sure you two are thoroughly decent folks, as you put it." "We most certainly are," Pete said, shaking Edmund's hand enthusiastically. The gnomes then proceeded to walk amongst each other and make the appropriate greetings until inevitably one of the Belgica gnomes discovered Maya. They all gathered around her and talked in their own language until Edmund finally said, "This is most irregular. A human girl is travelling with you?" "It's a long story," Pete said, "and involves a well-intentioned dragon and some very naughty goblins." Edmund nodded. "It seems that goblins are goblins the world over then." Maya thrust out her hand. "Hello there, my name's Maya McKinry." "Pleased to meet you," Edmund said, accepting it and shaking it warmly. "These are my friends, Michael and Stefan, and this fine fellow is my brother, Pierre." The rest of the Belgica gnomes nodded and smiled in unison. "I must ask," Pete interjected, "you don't happen to know a way out of these blasted woods, do you? It feels like we've been walking around in circles for hours." "Well, that is the answer we are also searching for, Peter," Edmund replied. "We had stopped to take a nap when you stumbled upon us." "Apologies again for that," Pete said, looking a little embarrassed. "Well, my back is feeling a little bit sore, but I suspect that it is the cold and the hard floor as much as it was your boot." At these words, the Belgica gnomes erupted into laughter, which took Pete slightly by surprise, and then he too and the rest of the West Country gnomes began to chuckle. "We are off to join Bubcha's resistance army," Edmund said, as the laughter died down. Bupcher, you say? Well, there's a stroke of luck, Pete said and clapped his hands together. We're trying to find Bupcher too. Well then, it seems we are destined to be travelling companions, Edmund said with a smile. The Belgian gnomes packed up their knapsacks, and they all set off again as one party. The fact that Pierre carried his family's hunting rifle over one shoulder bolstered everyone's spirits, and the dangers, either real or imagined, of just moments ago abated somewhat as the two tribes of gnomes walked together, chatting about family customs and their different rituals. The terrain even got a little easier underfoot, and they seemed to be making real headway. As the trees began to thin out ahead of them, Pierre, who was leading the party, stopped and raised his hand. Maya crept forwards and found herself staring out across the large open field. A thick bank of dark clouds covered the sky, and not a star could be seen in the heavens. At the other end, she could just make out the silhouette of a cart, and a creature that looked like a troll sitting on top. The figure sat very still. Well, there we are, Pete said to the group. I told you Joe Trammell was a friend to the gnomes. It's just as he said. That'll be our ride. I'm sure we can find room for you fine fellows if you wanted to join us. The Belgica gnomes bowed graciously, and Pete was just about to march out across the field when Pierre put out his hand and stopped him. He said something in Old Flemish to Edmund and pointed into the field with his rifle. I agree with Pierre. I think we should walk around the edge. It is less exposed, Edmund said to the group. Nonsense, Pete exclaimed. That'll take us ages. And what if that troll gets bored of waiting and leaves? We've wasted enough time wandering in circles as it is. And your man has his rifle, so what's there to worry about? Without waiting for an answer, Pete and the West Country gnomes set off across the field. Maya hung back for a moment, and then partly out of a sense of loyalty, but mainly because she didn't want to be left behind, hurried after them. Edmund and the rest of the Belgica gnomes had a brief chat, and then reluctantly followed too. When Pete was about halfway across the field, he raised a hand and yelled out, Hello there, sir! I believe you're waiting for us! The figure on the cart remained silent, seeming not to have heard Pete's greeting. I say there, we're friends of Joe Trammell, Pete shouted again, cupping his hands around his mouth to send his voice a little further. But still the figure remained silent and unmoving. The clouds parted a little, and the light from the moon spread across the field. As it reached the cart, Pete got a better look at the figure on top. Dismayed, he turned to say something to Edmund, but the Belgica gnomes had already turned on their heels and were running back in the other direction for the cover of the woods. It's just a scarecrow, tumbled out of Pete's mouth, as a loud clang echoed around the field, and one by one, each corner was illuminated by a blindingly bright floodlight. A siren sounded from somewhere in front of them, and below this, the faint growls and yaps of a pack of hungry wolves could be heard. Hobgoblins, Pete stammered. For goodness sakes, run for your lives! The tree line ahead of them exploded into life as a gang of goblin poachers, carrying clubs and nets and riding on powerful wolves, charged towards them. Maya stood frozen to the spot as the terrified gnomes scattered in all directions. From the corner of her eye, she saw one of the poachers bearing down on Catherine and Lily. Pete cried out, and Catherine chucked Lily into his arms just before she was scooped up into a net. Pete sprinted for the tree line, but in his haste, the uneven ground got the better of him, and he went tumbling down. Lily shot out of his arms and landed in the soft grass at Maya's feet. With no time to think, Maya grabbed the little gnomeling and ran for the cover of the trees. Yelps and snarls filled her ears. She could see up ahead that Edmund and the rest of his tribe had reached the safety of the forest. They turned and looked back in horror. Screams and panic echoed around the floodlit field. She clutched Lily to her chest and whispered words of encouragement to the crying infant. She was only 20 feet from the tree line when a great shadow suddenly bore down on her. As she turned her head, the horror of what was about to happen seemed to unfold in slow motion. The jaws of the snarling wolf lunged towards her, and she could feel the deadly heat of its breath on the back of her neck. But before it could bite down, its head snapped back and it crashed limply to the floor. The goblin rider mounted on top was thrown awkwardly from the saddle and tumbled across the grass, entangled in his own net. With confusion, Maya looked back towards the tree line. A wisp of smoke curled from the barrel of Pierre's gun. She smiled to him and nodded. At the sound of her name, she turned to see Catherine and Pete trapped in a net hanging against the side of the dead wolf. Don't worry, I'll get you free, she called out, rushing over to them and desperately pulling at the thick twine of the netting. Use this, Pete said, and thrust his pocket knife through the gap. Maya unfolded the little blade and sawed frantically at the coarse twine. "Hurry!" Catherine shouted, reaching through the net and stroking Lily's hair in an effort to calm the wailing child. "It's working," Maya said as one of the brittle strands gave way. As she threw a triumphant smile up to Pete, she saw in his eyes a sudden look of terror. He opened his mouth to warn her, but it was too late. A powerful blow lifted Maya clean off of her feet and up into the air, and then she felt the coarse twine of a net pull tight against her skin, and the world around her snap to black. Thanks for listening. As always, stay safe, stay indoors, and look after one another.